Righty, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 12 of animal law. It's the final week of the term, obviously. Big revision session. So this should be a really great opportunity to talk through some of the key themes and ideas that we've been thinking about in this unit. And we're very, very fortunate to have Alex back with us this evening to talk through it all. So that's really great. I'm not sure if Alex has had a chance to talk through a little bit about how this evening will work already. But basically the format for this evening will be a quick-ish overview of the take-home exam, how that's going to work, the sort of the nuts and bolts of that. And then we've got a practice question, which I think should give you a good sense of the kind of question and the kinds of things that you'll be asked on the exam, and how you can go about answering that. And so we'll talk through that. We'll do a bit of brainstorming on that, and then we'll also talk about the lessons that you should draw from that practice exam for your revision. We'll probably have a quick little break at that point. Then we'll come back. There'll be space for you guys to raise your questions, comments, and concerns about the exam and the unit as a whole. And then we'll work through sort of talking through the tutorial questions. Hopefully you will have seen on Moodle, we've posted a list of all the tutorial questions from the unit, so for your revision. And then I've also highlighted some ones that I think will be most useful for your revision. So we'll focus on those highlighted ones as well. So that's the brief overview. We might get underway by talking about the exam itself. So hopefully, I think most of you have probably done take-home papers at CQU before, but as this is a first-year subject, it's possible that some of you haven't had that opportunity. So what I'll quickly do, I'll share my screen, and what I'll show you is the cover page for the exam. So this is the sort of key instructions that you'll be greeted with when you log in and start the exam. So the date's been sort of mentioned in a few different spots now, but the exam itself will take place at 3 p.m. Queensland time on Tuesday, the 15th of February. You'll have 6 hours working time. So that means that we've got a final due time of 9 p.m. on the Tuesday, the 15th. So some key instructions and details about the exam. There's 5 short answer questions. Each one's worth 10 marks. You answer all 5. So for a combination of 50 marks, and the exam's worth 50% of your overall grade. We'll talk a little bit later about the word limit and about how long your answers should be. So we'll circle back to that one. The exam lasts for 6 hours, as I said, and the due time is 9 p.m. Queensland time. I cannot stress enough that it's important that if you're not in Queensland, that you take a note of that Queensland timing, because unfortunately the system doesn't acknowledge if you're, starting later because you're in Western Australia and therefore finishing later. It all runs off Queensland time. So if you're in a different state or, running off daylight savings or whatever, make sure that you've either worked out ahead of time, converted what 3 p.m. and 9 p.m. is, or you've got a Queensland time clock nearby or something like that to guide you. So submissions after 9 p.m. Queensland time will not be accepted. They won't be marked. It's an automatic 0, and extensions are not possible for the take-home exam. So as I said, a lot of you will be familiar with this before, but just in case any of you have not come across those kinds of conditions, really important that you're treating this like an invigilated exam. There's a set time limit. It's not possible to really deviate from that. The other important thing about thinking of this like an exam is that I suppose exam conditions apply, in the sense that just like you can't in an exam hall get up and have a chat with the person next to you about your answer has to be your own work. You can't discuss the exam with other people, and other students obviously, but also people outside the unit or the university. It's got to be 100% you. Obviously, you can refer to materials that we've talked about in this unit, as long as they're properly cited. But in terms of the brain power for your answer, of course, that has to be all you. The other thing that I thought it would be useful to, I suppose, note is the criteria under which the exam's assessed. So these are from the unit profile, and basically each answer is marked according to how well the answer demonstrates an understanding of animal welfare laws and regulatory systems, demonstrating problem-solving skills, understanding the ethical dimensions of animal law, and written expression, acknowledgement of sources, etc. So those are the real kind of nuts and bolts of the exam itself. We'll circle back then and talk about the questions and how you go about answering them. Last week, we had a little bit of a discussion about the kinds of questions, in terms of there are some questions that are more, I suppose, theoretical based, open and discursive. And then some of the questions are a bit more doctrinal, giving you more of a kind of a legal problem to resolve. The question that I got asked last week, that I now have a better answer to as well, in terms of the length of the answer. What will generally be expected is around about 400 words per question. And so that extends out to about 2,000 words across the 5 answers. The 400 word, I suppose, limit is not fixed. You might find some questions take you a little bit longer. Some questions take you a little bit less time, but across the 5, you'll work out to about 400 words per question. And the key reason that I say that, obviously, if you're coming in under, or significantly under across all 5 questions, the concern would be that you haven't covered everything that you need to cover, or included enough critical analysis and discussion in the answer. But equally, if you're going too far over, the concern would be that you are maybe being too descriptive, maybe including long quotes when you could be paraphrasing, and generally not being critically reflective in your answer. Instead, just sort of trying to word dump all your notes on that particular topic into the answer, which in terms of the criteria doesn't really demonstrate understanding or knowledge and problem solving skills. Instead, what it demonstrates is, okay, you read the study guide and you could put a few bits into an answer. So making sure that your answers are critical and thoughtful, rather than just trying to put everything that you remember about that topic onto the page. So that's why we think that 400 word, I suppose, guide should be a useful one to you. And I think it's worth remembering as well that your discussion forum posts were about 200 words each. And when you think about the amount of discussion and critical analysis and use of sources where relevant that you could fit into those discussion posts, 400 words is double that. So that should give you a sense of what is possible and what's feasible in in each of those answers. So that's the kind of the nuts and bolts of the exam itself and how you can be approaching that. Before we move on, are there any questions or concerns about the exam itself that you'd like to raise? Okay, perfect. Anything that you wanted to add, Alex, at that point?
Thanks, Jacob. I suppose I just wanted to reiterate everything you said, but also when you read the questions, just take a few moments to think about the question and do your best to answer the actual question. And so I suppose I'm saying that as an addition to Jacob's comment about it's not, I'm going to write everything I know about this topic. It's really trying to get you to answer a specific question. So do keep that in mind. And you might need to just read the question carefully and then just take a minute or so to think about that question and then go about answering that. I hope that that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. And I suppose by way of hopefully reassurance is also to mention that, you know, we're also conscious of the limits of, you know, there's only so much that you can say in 400 words. And so, you know, the expectation isn't, you know, the same as your research essay, for example. You know, I'm not expecting that level of research and discussion and analysis, obviously. But instead it's more about what can you feasibly fit into the 400 words without compromising on, you know, the critical analysis and reflection as well. And so I think that's probably a good segue then into the example practice question, because I think that will highlight some of those points. And then from there, we can discuss a little bit more about, you know, what are the expectations and how can you best prepare yourself to answer similar questions or similar style of questions in the exam. So I'll share my screen. I'll present you with the question. What weeks are we focusing on? We'll go through the practice question and then I'll come back to that question, Jamie. It's something that we've talked about a few weeks, and the really brief answer is all of the weeks are potentially relevant and are open to your discussion, but you don't necessarily have to know the absolute ins and outs and details of every single week. And so I think the practice question does a really good job of highlighting that. So we'll revisit the question a little bit more after we've been through that one. So I'll show you the practice question. We'll open it up for a discussion and I suppose some of your brainstorming about the content of the subject matter itself, but then also your thoughts about how you might go about answering that question. And then we'll use that discussion to frame the rest of the tutorial. So I'll share that screen now. And so this is an example of the, I suppose, more theoretical discursive questions. As I said, there'll be doctrinal ones as well, but those are a little bit more similar to ones that you've encountered in the tutorial as well. So we'll talk about that style a little bit later. This is a good example of the more theoretical question that you'll get. And so the question is, what's anthropocentrism? And are Australia's animal cruelty laws anthropocentric? So we'll open it up for a bit of early brainstorming and discussion. And then from that, we'll pull out some useful pointers for preparing for the exam. So what are your initial thoughts about this question?
So Jacob, the belief from my understanding, is that the value is like human-centered, and that all other beings are means to human ends. So essentially, humans are superior and can control the environment and everything that's contained within it.
Yep. So thinking about defining anthropocentrism as the starting point. Yep. Awesome. What else?
I would maybe have a look at my notes and see if I can back up my definition with a quote by maybe like Aristotle or something, or one of the theologians that we'd looked at, just to reinforce the definition that we already have in our mind, and then eventually link it up with maybe an example in one of our legislations or codes that exemplifies why you think or why you don't think that the Australia's animal cruelty laws are anthropocentric or not.
Yep, absolutely. So thinking as a first step, defining anthropocentrism and then providing a little bit more elaboration on that definition. And then from there, finding an example of how Australia's animal cruelty laws either are or aren't anthropocentric. Yeah, I think that's a good overall approach. Anyone else? So I suppose building on that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I might say a bit about that there are no uniform animal cruelty laws. And so looking at maybe the differences between, obviously difficult to do in 400 words, but I might write something about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, I think this is a good example of where the limits of the question are, I think, for one, quite apparent, and for two, should hopefully be reassuring for you guys, for me to explain that, yeah, I'm well aware that there is only so much that you can say in 400 words. And so while Australia's laws are not uniform, it's really great to mention that. And I'm not expecting, a blow by blow of every jurisdiction's laws and the ins and outs in each. So yeah, that's a really good point. Mentioning that there's a lack of uniformity, and then either picking Queensland as an example to focus on, or pulling out a theme that's reasonably common across the provisions. Those are two good approaches, and it would be fine for you to pick one versus the other, without it would be unreasonable to expect you to try and do a huge comparative analysis of all of them. Absolutely. So thinking then perhaps about some of those potential examples and some of the potential provisions here in Queensland. For one, perhaps what would your argument be? Are Australia's animal cruelty laws anthropocentric or not? Because the question does lead you to make an argument, to come on one side of the fence or the other, and then as a follow-up, thinking about an example that might be useful to support the position, whichever way you choose to go.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah,
Jacob?
of course.
No, I don't want to interfere with the brainstorm. That's all.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So it's really good to start, obviously, with the definition to answer this question. And then in terms of the second part of the question about, I think everyone's, or the people who've responded have made similar had similar ideas of, yeah, let's find an example of that. And I suppose I can see in this answer to this question, I would probably do a definition and then think back about the whole rationale for anti-cruelty laws. What are they for? And I was just thinking off the top of my head in this relation to this one. Can I go ahead and say that, Jacob?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I know. I feel like I'm one of the students tonight. Put my hand up. Okay, so I was thinking that you could do, there's like 3 little sections of this one. So there's a nice definition of anthropocentrism. And if you can say it in your own words, that's like even better, and get it correct, get the ideas correct, that's even better. And then we think about the rationale for anti-cruelty laws. We know there, I was thinking about the Animal Care and Protection Act. Remember we talked early on about the purposes of the Act? Remember that? And some of the purposes are to ensure that there isn't unnecessary harm put to animals, but one of the other purposes was for the reasonable use of animals as well. Okay, so that reasonable use within the purpose of the Act reflects the idea that those laws are set up for human use of animals, so it's human-centered. That reflects a human-centered approach. So, you know, that's just a kind of easy way of thinking about it. But you also, in the middle of that, you could think, we've talked about, and I know we'll go into this a little bit more later, is that kind of thing, we have this tension between animals as property or animal rights, and then animal welfare. And animal welfare accepts the human use of animals. And so all of Australia's animal cruelty laws are based on the animal welfare paradigm or framework, which accepts and comes out of an anthropocentric view of the relationship between humans and other animals. So just, I don't know whether that's kind of can get you thinking about the content that we've used. And there's probably many different examples that you could draw on in answering this question.
Thanks, Alex. I'll build on one point and then I'll open it back up to brainstorming, thinking about the potentially many different examples that we could be drawing on. What this question highlights in terms of Jamie's question earlier about, you know, what weeks should we be focusing on? You obviously, the discussion about animal cruelty and anthropocentrism is, you know, quite clearly drawing on topics from weeks 2 and 3. But then in terms of thinking about an example to support that, there's any number of topics or weeks content that you could be drawing on. You know, we might even go to our week 11 topic around you know, animals in sport and the use of animals for, I suppose, entertainment purposes. And so what you can be doing in crafting your answers, obviously the questions, you know, point you to some topics. It's not completely open slather, but then within that, there's flexibility for you to focus on the topics or the sub themes that, you know, you feel most comfortable with, or you feel like you know the most about. And so there's flexibility for you to draw on an example from, you know, any number of weeks that best supports your position or the statement that you want to make. And so, you know, when I've been saying it's potentially all relevant, one is because the questions themselves, you know, can draw on one or multiple weeks, but two, it's to give you guys, I suppose, agency in answering this exam question, to choose topics and to choose examples that, you know, enable you to put your best foot forward and to talk about topics that you feel like you really know a lot about. So I suppose with that in mind, I'll open the discussion back up and we can perhaps have a discussion about some examples where, you know, we think that the animal cruelty laws are or aren't anthropocentric.
The domestic violence legislation, Jacob, that you know, it's the animals aren't recognised as victims themselves.
Yep, absolutely.
So that's it sort of follows that theory that animals shouldn't be harmed so as not to hurt the human sort of thing. So it's along those lines.
Yep. So I guess thinking about you know, the cruel acts done towards animals are, you know, in the context of domestic violence legislation, only cruel insofar as they do harm to a human as well. Yeah.
There is also in the legislation 3BI, where it says achieve a reasonable balance between the welfare of animals and the interests of persons whose livelihood is dependent on animals.
Yep. Yep. So sort of coming back to Alex's point earlier about thinking about the purpose of the act and yeah, under section 3, sort of quite explicitly pointing out the I suppose competing objectives and perspectives that the act tries to capture. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I just like trying to keep the balance between having a business, making money off the animals. That's right, and taking care of them at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, thinking about, you know, I think your example there really quite neatly fits into I suppose the agricultural use of animals, and thinking about the exceptions for the animal cruelty provisions, as long as, you know, you're complying with relevant codes or industry standards, potentially being an example that ties in with that as well. Absolutely.
And also the animals that are used for experiments, like for drugs and for medical purposes as well, because, you know, we don't like the animals being treated like that, but we do enjoy the benefits. So it's hard trying to find a balance.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's another good example. Anyone else?
So cruelty is an aspect which I see as being subjective to an animal, but we've currently got a legal status for animals which renders them as being proprietary. So for as long as animals are considered proprietary, it leaves them exposed to rights that humans have as to how they can exercise those rights over animals. Those rights may still manifest as cruelty to the animal, even though they're not clearly defined as cruelty per, say, an act, legislation, or case law.
Okay, so you're saying, if I understand you correctly, that sort of by definition, the proprietary status of animals immediately renders any animal law anthropocentric?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
Impliedly, like for instance, we've got, as humans, we can take ownership of an animal, but are we readily capable of looking after that animal? If we look at, for instance, the number of people who took on ownership of animals during COVID and lockdown, and after that period, we're no longer able to take care of those animals, and having to surrender those animals to shelters, for instance, that could somewhat manifest as cruelty to the animal, because we've got an animal who was so used to being in the comfort of an owner and now has to move on to another owner. What about the mental sentience of the animal?
It's an interesting point. I'm going to throw to you in a minute, Alex, just to make sure that I'm getting the nuance right. In terms of thinking, I think it's a good point in a more, I suppose, philosophical sense, in terms of thinking about the answering this question or a question like this. The way that, and this comes back to Alex's point earlier about being really careful to make sure that we're answering the question as it's worded. Thinking about the wording Australia's animal cruelty laws, I think would be really important to make sure that your answer is tying back to particular legislation or a legislative framework. And in particular, if we were using Queensland's ACPA as an example, pulling out the distinction between, the duty of care versus the sort of generalized cruelty provision. I can see what you're saying about taking on responsibility that you're not necessarily prepared for, and then subsequently abandoning or having to rehome an animal as being cruel by, I suppose, societal standards. But in terms of framing the example around Australia's animal cruelty laws, there might perhaps be a little bit of difficulty bridging the nuance between Section 17 and Section 18, unless I'm completely misunderstanding those provisions, Alex.
I think Michael, your premise is really good, because it shows, like you're saying, about this division about property, animals are property, and that in itself means that there is a sort of irreconcilable status that's about their kind of inferior status to humans. Okay, so that's a really good thought. I think that's a good thought. But then the example you gave is an interesting one in terms of what's happening in our society right now. But could you think about how does that relate to how we try to protect animals in law? And the one that I just thought of when you were talking about that, if you wanted a case example that related to animal cruelty laws, is, remember in the Act, there is a definition of what is an animal. I mean, this might be a bit sort of out there, I suppose, but there's a definition of what is an animal. And part of the definition of what an animal is it excludes human beings as being animals as well. So I sort of think that that's a example of what you're saying, is that within that legislation, the fact that the definition of an animal is, because humans are animals, we are animals, but the definition of an animal excludes a human. And that's a legislative example of the point of the kind of legal theory point that you're making there. So that's one, but that one's a little bit of a probably less obvious argument. But if you could think of another example of that, then I think that that's a good idea, but it's just the challenge of finding an example.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I don't want us to come across that we're piling onto you, Michael, but I think it's a really good illustration of this feeds as well into, I suppose, how much you can fit into a 400-word answer and how much we can expect of a 400-word answer. But yeah, being, I think, quite targeted is really important. But in terms of your thinking, I think you're definitely on the right track. Any other thoughts or arguments or impressions in relation to this potential question? I say potential question. It's not a potential question. It's a practice question.
I have one really quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Because it does say animal cruelty laws, are you happy if we were to answer broadly and say, because there's this one little part that we think doesn't, that puts humans first, we would say as a whole, no, our laws aren't, they are anthropocent, I can't say that word. They are that way? Or would you prefer us to pull out something and say this particular part is, you know what I mean? Like it could go either way. Would you rather us say, if it's mentioning laws, plural, is there room to say, because there is one element that doesn't match all of this, that we would say as a general rule that it can't I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a good question, and it feeds into this idea of these are only short answer questions, to thoroughly answer that question. Yeah, you have to analyze every bit of legislation that there is to come up with, either a concrete answer one way or the other, or an answer that at least says, for the most part, blah, 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 which is just completely beyond what we can expect for a 400-word answer. So instead, what the expectation would be is that you just pick an example that's, at least reasonably, not necessarily generalizable, but that's not obviously just completely cherry picked, but an example that supports, whatever argument you're trying to make to say, look, here's a tendency, here's evidence of the way that animal cruelty laws are anthropocentric or aren't anthropocentric. So yeah, it's definitely taken into account that you've only got so much space. You don't have the word count to fully analyze all the laws that are out there. But as long as you can come up with a reasonable answer, a reasonable example that highlights your knowledge and understanding of the core concept and some of the key bits of legislation that we've covered in this unit, then that's, you're on your way to coming up with a good answer to that question.
I think we could summarize that by saying there's quite a bit of freedom. You have quite a bit of freedom because in this unit, the unit explores lots of different ideas and examples of legal obligations towards animals. So there's a freedom there in that you've explored lots of things, but amongst that, when you answer your questions, you need to answer the question. So you might actually find when you might have several things that come to mind when you read your question. You might think, oh well, it could be that, I think it was Tammy said, animals in research or domestic violence or that, and so you might have several things that might come to mind, but you just want to hone in on something that you might have paid more attention to whilst you were studying, and you've got more of a feeling for it, or you feel like you're more solid on that. So you have freedom in that respect, but you just need to make sure that you're actually answering the question.
Yeah, and to build on that, I suppose it's where there is freedom, which a lot of these questions do give you. It's up to you to pick an example and to pick a good example, and you've got the freedom to do that. When I'm marking, I'm not going to be thinking, they talked about domestic violence as the example, but the example should have been greyhound racing. I'm not, the examples, because there's the flexibility, I'm not expecting a particular example over another. It's up to you to choose an example that fits. Obviously, if you're picking something that doesn't fit especially well, say you chose something international, whereas the question's very clearly targeted at Australia, that's obvious, that's going to be a problem. But where you've got that flexibility, you're not going to be marked down for picking, I suppose, a wrong example, because there won't be one, but it's about choosing an example that you feel like, for one, fits with the question, and for two, that you can, apply with critical analysis and nuance.
Can I add to that too, Jacob? I was just thinking when you were speaking that the other thing is that there's so much content and opportunity for examples, and is that try to keep keep your answer to something that we've covered, the course, the unit materials. You know, your answers need to be based in the unit materials, and that is quite wide in breadth anyway. So I would sort of just say we've got plenty of, you know, information to work with. So I wouldn't choose to go off on a wild tangent kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know, there's more than enough content within the unit to cover, you know, and obviously the questions have been developed based on the unit content. So it's, you know, if you stick to the unit content, you'll have more than enough material to do well with those questions. Absolutely. Any other questions about this question and perhaps what it might mean for your revision, or reactions or examples to the question itself? Awesome. All righty. Well, we might take a brief pause there, and then we'll come back after. We'll have a 10-minute break till 7:55, and then after the break, that will be an opportunity for, I suppose, a more open-ended Q&A about the unit materials. And then after that, we'll talk through some of the tutorial questions and think about some of the key ideas and concepts and skills that will be useful to you in the exam. So we'll take a quick pause, and we'll be back at 7:55 to resume the conversation. And I suppose for those of you watching this recording at home, what I might do, I'll pause the recording and then we'll start again, so you don't have 10 minutes of fast forwarding to do. So welcome back, everyone. We're going to start off this second half of the tutorial with a bit of a question and answer about both the exam and the unit itself. So the first question that we've got in the chat is whether IRAC is optional in answering the questions. So, you know, this is relating to the more doctrinal or the open, the more sort of problem-based questions. So IRAC being, you know, the formulaic issues, rules, application, conclusion. It's optional, is the short answer. I think for those of you who've had me in other subjects before, my view is that IRAC is good for helping you as a thought process and work through identifying the issues, identifying what's relevant and that sort of stuff. But my opinion is that it doesn't lend itself to thoughtful, critical, nuanced application of the law to the facts. That's my personal opinion. It's not something that I mark to, in the sense that if you use IRAC, you don't get marked down for it, right? If you use IRAC, that's completely fine. But my observation is that I often find when people use IRAC, they get locked into those headings and their application and critical analysis suffers as a consequence of falling into those categories. So you can absolutely use IRAC if you want to. You are not going to be penalized in any way for using it. But if you are going to use IRAC, make sure that you are still demonstrating those problem-solving skills, demonstrating that critical analysis in your application, especially. But yeah, you know, so I think optional is a good way of characterizing it. Some discussion about the word count as well, and so roughly what I would be expecting is about 2,000 words. It's not fixed. If you went a little bit under or a little bit over, you're not going to be marked down for it necessarily. The main thing is if you're straying way above, in particular, if you're below, that's going to be a problem because you probably just haven't included everything you need to. If you're straying way above, the concern is that you're not developing a targeted, effective, concise, critically reflective answer. So about 400 words per question is the guide, I'd say, is the best word for it rather than limit. Anything that you want to add at this point, Alex, before I open up to other questions?
Yeah, I just had a couple of thoughts. It might be useful for you to think about what have we talked about in, so I was thinking about the IRAC question, which is like, Mr. So-and-so, the kind of problem questions that probably as law students we become very familiar with. But in this unit, we've drawn on a more variety of skills. So developing your research skills. And I hope now at the end of this unit, you're feeling more confident in terms of your legal research skills. So we've looked at the actual process of research and we've drawn on a lot of research. Another theme of this unit is law reform. So we've talked about how law changes and what are the processes that drive that change. And then we've also looked at a few cases. So there is case law that we've explored as well. So there's all of these different legal materials, but we might be using them in a slightly different manner than what we would when we're answering a stereotypical IRAC problem. And the other thing I always think about with IRAC is that it can be a very structured process, like Jacob was talking about earlier, but also IRAC is just, in a sense, a very sensible way of answering a question anyway, isn't it? If you think about, well, what is the issue? What is it I'm trying to answer? And what are the kind of principles and applying those principles? Even if you go back to that practice question we had about anthropocentrism, there was a principle, and then we asked you to, or some people suggested some really good examples. So that's application. And then concluding, yes, animal cruelty laws are anthropocentric. It's the same process, the logical structure of an argument, I think, that really underlies IRAC. And when we're teaching it in the first years of law school, it is very structured, but it becomes increasingly more sophisticated the more you develop your skills. So I hope that kind of reassures you in that respect, is that we're using IRAC in a way quite often when we try and answer problems, not just the stereotypical law problems.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that's a good point. And to clarify, so that it doesn't seem like you're getting too inconsistent viewpoints, I think IRAC is good absolutely for helping you plan an answer, and you can then use it to format the answer as well. But what I'm saying is, if you're doing that, just making sure that you are giving yourself the space for that critical analysis is really important. So yeah, just a point of clarification, because I think it could have come across as I'm saying don't use it and Alex is saying do use it, but I think we're actually sort of saying the same thing in terms of
you're agreeing.
Certainly use it to plan your answer, and then you can use it to actually write out your answer, but as long as you're doing it in a careful way. Or you might choose to, having used IRAC to plan the answer, structure things slightly different, and that's fine too. Any other questions about exam, or we're thinking more broadly now about the unit itself and the material?
Can I just ask a quick question about those scenario questions?
Yes.
So is it, whether or not you can let me know, I don't know, but so we're going to have a scenario, and then is it like one question, or is it, you know, sometimes you can, in our example tutorial questions, there can be 3 questions based on that scenario, or is it more sort of, you know, a one question thing, or can we not know?
You can know. I'm just trying to work out what the most useful way of answering it is. What you will find is those sort of in the tutorial questions where they ask you kind of sub questions, often really what those sub questions are you know, really just all the kinds of things that you need to be talking about in terms of a complete answer anyway. So if a tutorial question sort of had, you know, here's the scenario, what are the relevant provisions, how might they apply to Jim's scenario, is there an exception that might be relevant to Jim, and what penalties might apply. Whereas the exam question might just sort of say, advise Jim. And in advising Jim, you're answering kind of all those sub questions anyway, but it's not necessarily spelled out for you as exactly as that. So
that makes sense. Thank you.
That's right, isn't it, Alex? I think
that's how I see it. Exactly.
One question is definitely like that, and I'm trying to remember if the second one is as well. But yeah, you won't necessarily get all the sub bits, but you should be, the tutorial questions are preparing you to think about those sub elements, and they should be included in the answer.
I just noticed also a question, Jamie, when you were saying in your about the word count, that you also said the interesting time schedule. Did you have a question about the actual time schedule for the exam?
It was just more it was a bit of a shock when I saw the time schedule. It doesn't really need to be focused too much on. Obviously, we can't change it now, but I just thought it was interesting how it was, you know, around 3 to 9 in Queensland, and right in the middle of the day with kids and dinner and all the rest. And I actually haven't had that occur in the units I've been taking so far. So that's all, just a bit of feedback. That's okay.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Jamie. It's a tricky one, and it's unfortunately a product of, we basically have a morning shift of a 6-hour exam from 9 till 3, and then an evening 3 till 9. And it's, yeah, unfortunately it's beyond our control, that sort of stuff. But I'm just trying to think if there's, you know, that's feedback that I can certainly pass up the chain. I'm just trying to think if there's a useful way that you guys, if that's a shared view, if there's a way that feedback can be passed on as well, because it's the kind of thing that doesn't really get captured in the unit evaluations that you fill out each term. I will pass the feedback on, and if I can come across a way that, you know, collectively you guys are able to pass that feedback on as well, that's,
Jacob, if you want to pass on also, it's a really bad time with storms and that come through in the evenings. I've had it with previous take-home paper. A storm hit through the evening, and it was just really stressful because you know, I couldn't get any internet, and it took me about 2 hours of my time to get my internet back to actually get my submission in. So it wasn't you know, kind of as polished as what I would have liked it, but you know, that is an issue with that time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'll pass that on. You know, unfortunately, I don't know especially in this term 3 with such a consolidated exam timetable, there are limits, but absolutely the feedback is valuable, and I appreciate that. And yeah, I'll pass that one up to the people who might hopefully be able to do something about that for forthcoming terms. Circling back into questions in the chat, we've got there's no format for referencing. We to assume that referencing should conform with AGLC 4th edition or a watered down version. Basically, it's watered down. If in doubt, just default to AGLC 4th edition. You can get away with a little bit more, and we'll be putting up a guide probably later this week, I think, Alex, for that goes into a little bit more detail about gives you some examples of referencing that's okay in the exam. But it's safest to just go with AGLC 4th edition. But you can get away a little bit with, so for example, referencing the Animal Care and Protection Act as the ACPA and things like that. So we'll post a more concrete guide and some examples and stuff on Moodle later in the week. But the reality is you've got enough time to reference reasonably well in the 6 hours, and it's given that you across the 5 answers, it's a bit of writing, but it's not within that. You probably don't need to be, you're not drawing on as many sources as you did for your research essays. So it's not super onerous to reference reasonably properly. And then a follow-up question from Rachel: is in-text referencing okay like other exams? I think you're better off doing the footnoting for the simple fact that footnotes aren't counted in your word limit as long as they're, referencing rather than substantive content. So my advice would be to use footnoting rather than in text. The other advantage as well is that if you're doing in text, you really need to be providing a bibliography at the end as well. Whereas if you do it in footnotes, you can just put it all there and then it's done. So my advice is to go with footnotes rather than in text for the exam. Any other questions or comments about referencing?
Sorry, me again, last question.
No, that's all right. No, go ahead.
And this might have already been said before in the past, but is there any specific primary legislation that we should be focusing on? I know there's a lot involved when it comes to different animals, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that you said that we're covering a lot of topics and weeks within the questions, but yeah, is there like a top 3? Commonwealth and Queensland and all the rest, or just everything?
There's not, but my suggestion to you is this, right? Part of the benefit of this being a take-home exam is that you do have access to the internet, access to your notes. And so, and this sort of comes back to Alex's comments earlier about, having honed your research skills throughout this term. It's not so much that you should be going out and doing a ton of research, academic research like your midterm papers for these questions, but research in the sense of being able to quickly and efficiently go out and find the information that you need in a targeted sense. And so, yeah, I'm not going to say focus on these bits of legislation and don't focus on those ones. But what I will say is focus on understanding, you know, the core scope or the core themes that each legislation tries to get at. And so then if you encounter a particular question in the exam, you'll know, oh, that's ACPA, or oh, that's the Nature Conservation Act. And then you can use those research skills that you've been using to go out and find the particular relevant provisions or sections that you need. So that's, yeah, in the absence of giving you legislation to focus on, my best advice is focus on the top stuff, because you can get the sort of the more fine-grained stuff as you need. In the chat, Darren suggested John Milburn's lecture on level 3 preparation. I have to say I haven't had a chance to view that one, but I'll have a look for it and put a link to it in Moodle. John's a very good lecturer that we've got here at CQU, so I'm sure it is good. But yeah, I'll track that down and I'll post that up for the benefit of people who haven't had a chance of looking into that one. Any other questions about the exam itself? A further question about AGLC4. So for example, getting the italics right. Yeah, it's more, the referencing is more about getting the substance right rather than the form necessarily. So it's not the end of the world if you know, the comma's in the wrong spot or something like that. But making sure that you're referencing clearly and accurately, in the sense of it's very clear when you've gotten information from somewhere else, you know, that's the most important thing. If you've quite clearly used AGLC through everything, you know, there's an expectation that you should be consistent. But yeah, I'm not going to lose sleep over italics being in the wrong spot or something like that necessarily.
It's just to add to Jacob, it's really, remember on that instructions page for your take-home paper, it's very important to acknowledge your sources. Okay, so and that's really what this referencing is about. I mean, obviously you're demonstrating your knowledge. For example, if you refer to legislation, you know, be specific about the provision, etc. But keep in mind there's two reasons that you're referencing. You're acknowledging sources and you're also being specific about the information that you're giving us.
Yeah, so you know, making sure that you're spending the time to communicate what's your original idea and what's stuff that you've basically learned from the unit and where that's come from. And yeah, Alex says, you know, there's incentive to do that because you're showing how much you know about the topic. And yeah, you know, as a matter of academic integrity, obviously it's critical as well. Awesome. Further questions, I suppose, about the unit as a whole, or particular content that anyone wanted to revisit. And if not, yeah, that's fine. We'll dive straight into some of the tutorial questions.
I wanted to ask how many questions are scenario advice questions and how many are more law reform questions?
I don't know that any are specifically law reform. In terms of doctrinal to to sort of the more theoretical questions. Are you happy to say the split, Alex, or should we leave that one?
Oh, gee whiz, I know it's really hard. Look, maybe we could say this. There will be some scenario questions. Okay. So there'll be a mix. It'll be a mixture of types of questions. Does that help, Rachel?
Not really, because if you want to pass this subject and you're not really into law reform, it's going to matter more than, you know, if you are into law reform or you're an activist. So that's why I'm trying to work out, you know, how much is, you know, based on what the law is and what we've learned in that regard, and what other people think the law should be, and how we're going to answer that. So yeah, it does matter.
When I'm talking about, okay, so when we're talking about law reform, what we're talking about is learning through case examples about how the law changes. So remember when we talked about the article about egg labeling, and so the learning there was about actually the processes of law reform and how that happens and what are the processes at play. And then another example of that is when we talked about puppy farming, and we're talking about all the different ways that the law has responded to this problem. So we saw some case law, and we also looked at some legislative change as well. So that's how law reform is approached in this unit.
So how many questions?
There's 5 questions in the take-home paper.
Yeah, but how many questions are sort of on the scenario legislation the way it is? And
I think they said that they weren't going to say that, Rachel.
Well, they hadn't actually decided, had they?
Yeah, Alex answered, and she said there's a split. There's a split of each. I don't think it really matters. There's either going to be 2 of one and 3 of the other, or the other way around, I imagine.
Well, okay, Alison, thank you very much. But
no
my question is, I guess, to the teachers, is that you know, it's going to be hard to pass this course for people who aren't activists. In other words, people in industry, people who, you know, hold different views to a lot of the teaching and the way it's been slanted, I believe. And yeah, so that's what I want to know. If there's, say, 3 questions, you know, going towards more discussion questions, then, you know, you've got a good chance of failing the subject.
Can I just say, I'm not an activist or anything, but
either.
I feel like, you know, you just do what you need to do to pass the course, in my opinion. Well, that's what I'll be doing anyway.
I'll jump in here because I'll be the one marking it. So I think it's useful to have my perspective on that. And I think, again, sort of the practice question that I put up earlier, I think is useful to highlight that there's not an expected, you know, way of answering. There's, you know, as you've seen, there's flexibility in the arguments that you can raise, the examples that you can raise. And so it's not, you know, it's not a matter of, obviously you need to construct an answer that's relevant to the topic, but there's flexibility to take a particular position as long as that position is supported by examples, references, case law, etc. And so, and I said this in my answer earlier, but the questions aren't necessarily targeted so much towards law reform as they are towards analysing the current state of laws and the way that, you know, the perspectives and the philosophies that animate the laws in their current state. And so I think a good example of, and you know, part of the reason why I think Alex and I are hesitant to give an exact mix is because it does start to give away a little bit too much of the exam content, but also because there's at least one of the questions is sort of straddles the two, in the sense that there's a discussion of it's a discursive question rather than a problem-based one, but it's very heavily relies on discussing the case law. And so in that sense, it straddles the doctrinal and the discursive. So, I think it would actually be, in some sense, misleading to say an exact, there's a particular split, because you could interpret at least one of those questions slightly differently. So, that's part of the reason why I think it's actually not that useful to give you an exact split. But more broadly, I think it is important to stress that, there's an expectation that answers will discuss things that are relevant, and there's an expectation that answers will have critical nuance and draw on relevant examples and case law, etc. But beyond that, there's not an expectation that the answers take a particular position or reflect a particular perspective. And I think that, as far as preparing for the exam goes, I think that is important to put out there and to clarify. Absolutely.
I think there is, though, because like even the practice question, what is anthropocentrism, and are Australia's animal cruelty laws anthropocentric? I mean, that's a biased question, because basically it's saying, yes, they are, and you want us to argue that. But in my opinion, like the premise of the question is essentially, central to an abolitionist argument.
Forgive me, Rachel, but these are really intense questions, and I think the majority of the class might want to go on to the other tutorial questions that we have on tonight, instead of getting bogged down on the questions, even though it's really relevant and really good to sit talking about it. But
well,
anyway.
Jamie, you've had a fair bit to say tonight.
I
This is
have.
the first time I've actually spoken up. So is that just a nice way of saying shut up and go away?
No, it's just a nice way of saying I would like to move on to the tutorial questions, and I have a feeling everybody here would too.
I think perhaps the best thing to do moving forward, and for one, I think a few times it came up in the discussion of that practice question that there were more than one position that could be raised, even though in the discussion generally only one perspective was. And we can probably leave that one at that for now. You're more than welcome, Rachel, to raise a further discussion in Teams or on Moodle, and we can continue the example of that. I'll put the practice question up on Moodle as well. And yeah, perhaps the best thing is to leave it at there for now, and we can move on with some of the tutorial questions as well. So with that in mind, I'll share the screen. So hopefully you've all had a chance to look at the, well, I've had a chance to see the consolidated list of the tutorial questions that we have up on Moodle. If not, I believe they're under the week 12 tab on Moodle. And the key thing really just that I should stress with this list, and in particular, what I've done is I've highlighted ones that I think will be most useful to you in preparing for the exam. I haven't highlighted the ones necessarily on content, and you'll see that because I've highlighted at least one from every week. But really, what I'm doing is targeting questions that have got key themes or practice key skills that if you do those ones and give a really good attempt at answering those, that will practice the skills and the information that you'll need to hopefully do well on the exam itself. So we'll sort of skip through a bit and we'll jump ahead to, so this is week 2, question 2. We won't necessarily revisit the Sunstein reading, but sort of, and what we'll do for each of these questions, just to make sure that we cover enough of the useful and the good information that we'll bring forward and will be, you know, valuable to you in your exam prep. What we'll do for each sort of highlighted question is just get a quick snapshot and a quick brainstorm of the key points, the key themes, and then I'll get Alex to weigh in as well with her expertise on each one as we go through. So thinking firstly about this one, discussing the strengths and weaknesses in the animal welfare and animal rights position. So just a few quick fire thoughts and reactions to this question. Otherwise, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, they're both concerned with animal protection, so they have that.
I'm not sure if it's just my sound or
we're not all vegetarians, and we do still use animals for different purposes, and you know, consumerism is driven on that to a point. So I'm just to throw it out there that maybe from an animal rights position that it's not maybe always a realistic goal to not use animals at all for anything and that sort of thing.
Yep. So pointing out the fundamental difference being, between you know, I suppose the acceptability of animal use and the extent of the protection afforded to animals. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts?
Probably including that discussion about the legal status of animals as property and how the animal welfare position not challenging that, but you know, the animal rights position and the abolitionist movement to and I guess the focus on seeing the legal status of animals differently, however that might look, as an animal rights element of animal rights position.
Yep, absolutely. Anything you wanted to add to that one, Alex?
Yeah, I think you both made really good points. Tammy, you were saying about all the pragmatic challenges that if we think about a world where all animals had personhood, how would that work? Okay, so that's a really important, so that could be used to discuss some of the issues that the animal rights position has, but also Alison really honed in on the kind of legal status that's assumed by each position as well. So I think they were both really good thoughts. Yeah. Anyone else have any other thoughts on that before we move along?
I'm just catching up on the chat. So Jet's added that animal rights for animals could hinder scientific progress and medical progress, and the cost of food in the agricultural sector could rise significantly. Yeah, so thinking about some of the broader implications of rights and yeah, the sort of the flow-on consequences that could have. I think the other interesting point as well being around, you know, rights attaching to personhood is an interesting element to that as well.
And I had one more thought I wanted to just share too.
Okay.
Is that no, just remember, if anyone looked at the Stephen Wise work, and what he does is this sort of autonomy and cognitive capacity. So then there's all these sorts of differentials within an animal rights position as well. So some animal rights advocates who want to change the status of animals, they might make graduations about cognitive capacity or autonomy, like with the Human Rights Project in the US and the writ of habeas corpus in relation to chimpanzees. Okay, so that's like a specific example of an animal rights arguments that's been put in front of the courts. Anyway, okay, I'll stop now, Jacob.
No, that's all good. We'll press on to question 1, parts 1 and 2 from week 3. So this is a scenario where Mr. Jones owns a piggery, identifying animal welfare requirements that might apply. And in particular, I think it's most useful, and especially thinking about kind of, well, so this is, I think goes to Tammy's question earlier about, you know, will the scenario be separated out into the sub questions? Thinking very briefly, broadly about, you know, the animal welfare requirements that apply, but specifically then thinking about in a particular issue where 4 pigs become dehydrated and 1 in particular sustains kidney damage, thinking about what might be useful or relevant or important here. Again, just sort of quick brainstorming some reactions. And I think what's relevant, you know, to some extent, you've had this question without notice or with little notice. And so it's a good example of if you've studied for, you know, a high level understanding of the ACPA, you can then kind of later dive into some of the more specifics later on. So, you know, thinking if this is probably going to be more of the high level brainstorming, what are the things that initially leap out to you as being important and relevant that, you know, you'd then be able to look up later.
No. You froze for a moment, Jacob.
Sorry. So
all right, that's okay. I was just also going to sort of like maybe in terms of brainstorming, remember this part 1, it's really about, it's kind of a statutory interpretation question. Remember that? We went from the Act about a regulation can make a code of practice, and then we looked at the regulation, animal care and protection regulation, and we looked at codes that are mandatory and those that are not. Anyway, I'll be quiet now. I'm just trying to prompt you.
That's all good. So yeah, well, I'll hand it over to everyone. Thinking about broadly animal welfare requirements, and then specifically thinking about this issue where the pigs have become dehydrated and there's been some injuries arising from that.
Did anyone have thoughts about part 1?
So that's where you have to find out whether it's a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 in the regulations, and so then because one will say must, which makes it like a mandatory code of practice, and others will be may, which will make it a more voluntary code of practice. So you have to see if it's mandatory or compulsory, because then you go back to the Act, I think it was section 15, that's 3, that says that you have to comply with a mandatory, so it's a breach not to comply with a mandatory code of practice. And so I think that's the back and forth that we had to do that week.
Sorry, that's right, Tammy, very good, well done. And so really this question was also about the relationship between the Act and the regulations too. And so the Act says that a code of practice can be promulgated or created under a regulation, and so then we go to the regulation. So it's about exactly what you said, finding out whether a code's mandatory or not mandatory, and then because remember that tricky bit too, that we had all these other documents called model codes of practice, and whether or not the question, have they been incorporated into the state legislation? Okay. So they were the kind of things we're exploring. But I think Jet also put up a really good point too. Well done, Jet. Got here, the welfare requirements come from Schedule 2 of the Animal Care and Protection, which contains the mandatory code for pigs. Yeah, well done. Okay, what about part 2?
Just generally, I'd talk about how Section 40 of the ACPA provides an exemption from animal cruelty offences if an act is done in compliance with the code of practice.
Yeah, okay. So, all right. Are you talking about part 1 or part 2 there, Alison? I've sort of avoided talking about Section 40 because it's actually quite complicated in terms of its status. But remember, okay, so just remember with part 1, we talked about, as Tammy was saying, Section 15. And then Section 15, subsection 3 makes it an offence to breach a mandatory code of practice. Remember that? Have a look at the Act. So Section 15, subsection 3 makes it an offence to breach a mandatory code of practice. Now, those exemptions in Section 40 and 38, how they apply is very complex. And actually, I've spoken about this with a couple of other animal law scholars and lecturers, and it appears that those exemptions might apply to other codes, okay? So I've sort of avoided getting into too much detail about that so as not to confuse you. But if you think about, firstly, Section 15.3 as being that breach of mandatory code requirement offence, so we'll call that a regulatory offence, okay? And then if we go on to part 2, where we've got, what have we got here? We've got an offence under the Animal Care and Protection Act, okay? So we could say that if you have a mandatory code of practice, for example, the one that Jet mentioned, Schedule 2, all right, and there's a breach of that, we could call it a regulatory breach under Section 15.3, but it could still be open to find whatever the act or omission, the harm sustained, could also amount to an offence, another offence under the Act, for example, a breach of duty of care or general animal cruelty offence, or we know about the serious animal cruelty offence, which sits in another piece of legislation, the Criminal Code. Okay? Are you looking at me seriously, Alison?
I wonder, Alex, for
no, I was just
the
reading
benefit
what's in the chat there.
Yeah, so there's some other provisions that have been raised in the chat as well, Alex. I'm wondering for everyone's,
yeah, sure,
for the benefit of
okay.
thinking about these kind of problem questions, problem-based questions. Just a quick 1-minute summary, maybe in the IRAC method of, pulling out the key for part 2, pulling out the key issue, pulling out a couple of the rules, and then I think you've probably covered most of the application in the broader discussion. But
you're asking me, Jacob,
sorry,
to just do
yes,
IRAC summary?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So for part 1, I would say the Animal Care and Protection Act provides the power for a regulation to create a model code of practice and the section number for that. And then we go to the regulation and we go to, I think it's Regulation 2, which tells us which schedules are mandatory and which are not mandatory. Okay, and exactly good, statutory interpretation skills, looking at the may and must, and then going to that schedule, which will outline the requirements that Mr. Jones is going to need and apply to the care of his pigs on his farm in Queensland. So just going through that process. And then when we go to and then also, well, it hasn't actually talked about a breach, but I just wanted to raise it. So, all right, so let's go to part 2. Mr. Jones' employee, Larry, he was running the piggery. He's done something, an omission, okay? He hasn't replenished the water. So we've got four pigs that have been dehydrated and one that's actually quite sustained kidney damage. All right, so how do we approach this? Well, there's 2 prongs to this. There's the mandatory code set out in Schedule 2, which sets out the requirements, including how often someone needs to look at the water and refresh water for the animals, okay? And then we could say that that could be a regulatory breach under Section 15.3 of the Act. Or we could also say that the facts leave it open as to whether it's also an animal cruelty offence as well. So you could argue both, or you would argue both. And so we've got a duty of care issue, but okay, so you could say a general animal cruelty offence, okay? You could argue that, and you need to go through the general offence, Section 18 in the Queensland Act, and look at all of the particular circumstances that might amount to cruelty, and also, is it unnecessary, unjustifiable? And in this case, it would be unnecessary and unjustifiable to neglect changing that water. And then we have a pig that sustained kidney damage. You could look at the general animal cruelty offence under Section 18, or if it sustained kidney damage, you could also go to Section 242 of the Criminal Code. And under Section 242, subsection 2, you can see that if an animal sustains severe or serious injury, the provision allows for either an act or an omission as well. Okay, so you could canvass or explore the different offences that might apply.
Alex, do we have to address the so in the access to water, for instance, where it says the person in charge, and I think we had this discussion.
Yes, we had this discussion. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I think in this scenario, okay, whether Mr. Jones is going to be technically in charge or not might rely on what kind of training has Larry had, for example. I think in this question, I would be happy for you to directly deal with Larry, okay? And not go beyond. He is obviously in custody and in charge of the animal. I think going beyond that raises too many complex sorts of issues of whether he's correctly qualified, etc.
But do we just so we would address it and we would say, like, we would talk about the definition of in charge or in custody, and say, okay, because he has been left to look after them, then yes, he is in charge. So yes, he is in breach. Sort of go through those steps. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay.
We'll press on. Thinking about, we'll skip question 1. Question 2 being another problem-based one that we might, again, being under the ACPA, we'll skip that one. I think it's worth a brief brainstorm about question 2 from week 5, and in particular, sort of thinking about, this first part, discuss production of chicken meat and associated animal welfare issues. You'll have seen from the practice question that, this is a sort of similar style in the sense of it's fairly broad. Obviously there's a lot, some of you did your entire research essays on this. So, it's a broad topic, but it's one that if you just pull out 1 or 2 really quick and insightful points, you pull out an example, and that's within the 400 words. It gives you a useful and critical analysis. So just some quick brainstorming about this first part of question 2. Sorry, I've just got the notification that the internet dropped out again. So thinking about just this first part as being a useful example of the type of exam question, in the sense that it's really broad, and it's acknowledged that it's really broad, but you can still pull out a specific smaller subset of the discussion to construct a 400-word answer from. So it's just some quick brainstorming about, you know, the production of chicken meat and some of the potential concerns that are raised.
So yeah, a couple of the notes that I had was about like the whole from the breeding to the stock to the hens, like it's a very technical scientific process, like involving genetics of the chickens. Eggs are being incubated, so they're not like under the mum's tummies and stuff like that, and they use heat to encourage growth and things like that. And that there is selective breeding to maximize growth rate, so that could lead to issues with, like, you know, the forming of bone density and things like that. Yeah, and again, with the selective breeding, like these animals that are taken to be used for the production of meat, they're grown very quickly as well. That was just a few. I've got about 10 dot points all up, but yeah, that's just a couple of them that I was drawing out.
Yeah, absolutely. So the sort of the issues with the growth and some of the health challenges that arise from that. Yeah, absolutely. Any other key ideas that pop up?
The slaughtering, that was the thing that stuck out to me that week, the electrified water bath and that sort of thing, and chickens putting their heads up trying not to. So I almost went vegetarian. It was really confronting to me. I actually had no clue that that's how naive I was, I guess, that I had no idea that that's how they slaughtered the chickens.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the process itself and the gaps and also the inconsistencies in oversight of the process. Yeah, we'll press on because we're short on time. But yeah, the key point to take away from this question is thinking about, yeah, obviously it's broad, but what we're happy for you to do is just to pull out, you know, one key example, one key idea, and within the context of that, give some critical analysis and discussion. You know, it's what you know, if you talked about the growth process or you talked about the sort of the slaughter process, I wouldn't be reading that and saying, oh, you should have talked about the other thing. I will be reading it on its own merits and saying, okay, within the context of that point, have you, you know, used good evidence, used good sources, that sort of stuff.
Jacob, can I just make one comment on that previous
yeah, of
one?
course.
Well?
Yeah.
In part, you know, that's okay. I know that we're running short of time. Just also with the second part of the question, just to go to some of the earlier discussion, is that you can discuss your reasons either way. Just you need to reference the material that we've used. So you don't need, you know, any perspective, as long as it's well argued, is that question is open to.
Yeah, as in terms of, you know, is there, yeah, absolutely. So, you know, if the question was more reform based, is there a need to reform? Absolutely. I'm open to an argument that says, you know, yes, the whole thing's terrible, we need to reform it, or an argument that says, no, you know, there's multiple competing interests that we need to balance. And I think that at the moment we've got that balance right. You know, yeah, it's either argument is fine. What matters is the way that it's argued and the sources. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. Question 6 was our, our research essay question. I wonder, Alex, maybe you could just very quickly give one really important or one really interesting point about each of these two cases. So not necessarily summarizing the case, but an interesting point about each.
Okay.
Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
No, that's this case was in WA, and it was about a woman who is a puppy farmer, and she was contacted by the regulator, and she made an undertaking and she breached the undertaking. Just there you go. That's my one 15-second summary of that case.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, good good cases to have another read of.
Is
Yeah.
it likely that we're going to have a question that is
Can you go back?
do a case note?
No. So okay. So you're not going to be asked a case note, but doing these sort of case note style questions as practice, there have been a few that pop up throughout the unit. So I've highlighted this as an example of, do the case note style questions rather than necessarily, these particular cases. But yeah, you won't get a case note question, but thinking about both the doctrinal and the more discursive questions, thinking about, having some key cases in the back of your mind to use as examples is relevant.
Yes, because you'll know the case. It'll come to mind really quickly. And then you'll also have a beautiful summary if you need to draw on any of the cases that we've looked at. I just wanted to say a couple of words about SLOS and SLOS. Remember, that's an animal cruelty case. So it was heard by Justice Bradley. It was on appeal from the magistrates court to the district court, and it was appealed on the basis of the sentence. These the couple were also puppy farming, and the reason, remember, we looked at these two cases because one was about the way that Australian consumer law is being used and that gives indirect benefits to the animals that are involved. And then we also had the other approach here with the Department of Employment, Economic Development and SLOS, which is the prosecution for animal cruelty. Okay, so that's why we looked at those two different cases.
Awesome, thanks, Alex. Sorry, my internet had cut out, so I thought you'd gotten both of them, but all good. All righty. Question 8, week 8, question 2. Let's just focus on the first part. So Jenny accidentally shot a parrot, and thinking about which section of the Nature Conservation Act applies, what does take mean, what would the maximum penalty be, and what would be the defense. So this goes to the question earlier about, will we get these parts? No, but these are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about in an answer anyway. Very quick. Sorry, go, Alex.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, do you remember going through this question and we looked at the Nature Conservation Act? Yeah, okay, that's great, Amy. So so outlines the category of animal, like endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild. Okay. And then where did you have to go? So say in this case it was a swift parrot, and so we had to first of all go to the Nature Conservation Act. Of animals taken, remember that legislative word, taken. So the number of animals and the status of the animals as well. Was it an endangered animal? Was it critically endangered? So then we had to turn our minds to, well, where do we find out where the swift parrot, for example, how do we find its status? Remember, we went to the regulations. We went to Schedule 1, and then we found the swift parrot and what was its status in terms of its conservation status. Then we could go back to Section 888 and then understand what class offence it was, and then what the maximum penalty would be for that offence, depending on the number of animals and their status, conservation status. Okay, so remember that legislative term taken has a whole lot of different actions could amount to taking. Okay, so and then we also talked about defences. Was it lawful? Which was it a subsection of Section 88? Is it Section 88(3) that provides a defence? Cross my fingers, I've got the subsection right there, did I? and that defence is whether it's a lawful activity.
I think we've lost Alex now. The key thing I'll quickly jump in and add as well with
what might be a lawful purpose, okay? But here we could see that Jenny was playing with her rifle, so that the facts there suggested it wasn't a lawful, probably going to be a lawful activity as such. Is that okay, Jacob? Does that?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thank you. The other thing I'll
Thank you.
quickly add, I think what's useful about this example is it highlights, what we've been saying about you don't need to know necessarily the absolute detail of every single act, as long as, when you're revising, the Nature Conservation Act, if you've got in your mind, if you're clear on the process in terms of, starting with the act, going to the regulation and being able to find your way around that, then being able to link that back to the act and the different classes of offences that Alex mentioned, that's what your study should be targeting at, rather than, trying to memorize, is the golden finch vulnerable or extinct or etc. So, focusing on the process so that you can apply that in the exam efficiently and effectively, rather than getting bogged down in the absolute detail of every single little bit of legislation that we cover. We'll press on. Thinking about wildlife, and in particular the comparison of the Legg and Riley arguments, and talking about the different approaches to managing feral cats and protecting wildlife in Australia. The reason I highlighted this question is I think it's really good practice for you in terms of looking at different perspectives on an issue, being able to compare and contrast different perspectives on an issue, and critically analyze arguments on their merits. I think that's a really useful skill to be honing, in general, but especially for this exam, is being able to compare and synthesize information from different sources. And yeah, I'll leave that question on there because we're over time at this point, but that's why that one's there. Obviously, do the exercise again with those sources, but as you're doing it, be quite conscious about the skills that you're really honing on that question. Similarly, question 3 from week 10, thinking about the different, the cosmetic ban and the different requirements of the code. Again, this is an example of, understanding the broader level principles, understanding the key processes, and sort of knowing where to look, rather than necessarily knowing the ins and outs of every last little bit of information. So again, really practicing building up those skills of knowing where to look, rather than not necessarily knowing what exactly word for word is in each section. And then lastly, question 11, week 11, question 1, going through, we only did this last week, so these should be hopefully reasonably fresh, but just going back over these cases and thinking about, the discussion in each case, and pulling out some of the key ideas in relation to the use of animals. Kadir, there was that discussion about, obtaining evidence and the different types of evidence. So revisiting those cases and thinking about some of the interesting ideas and principles that were raised in each of those as well, I think is really important. And then I think that's all I've highlighted. All right, I'm conscious that we're now 5 minutes over time, but are there any last questions, comments? Excellent. I mean, as we've been saying, this is an exam that is probably a little bit different to what you've done in other subjects. But it's one that, it's been set up, as we've said, to give you the scope to, and give you the agency to put your best foot forward and to use the knowledge that you've got, and to sort of play to your strengths as much as possible. Obviously we have to assess something. We can't just give you talk about anything, but within that, there's a lot of scope for you to do the best that you can with the knowledge that you've got. And as we've been saying, focusing on practicing the skills and the analysis is just as important as thinking about the content that we've been covering. Other than that, I'll sign off by saying, thanks for having me in the unit. I know that, I was a late draft in, but you've all been very welcoming, and it's been really fascinating discussing these topics over the past few weeks, and reading all your essays in particular was really great fun, and obviously not something that I thought I'd be doing at the start of the term, but a really, really eye-opening journey nonetheless.
Can I
Yes.
interject? And I
was going to, give you the final word.
Oh, okay. Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Jacob, for taking over while I was on leave. He's a legend, and you are a legend, Jacob, and I so much appreciate what you've done for our students and for animal law. So good on you, and thanks.
Oh, no trouble. You're going to make me blush. It's been good fun, and a privilege to join in the unit. So yeah, thank you, and thank you everyone for coming up to these tutorials and really engaging with the unit. It's really great to see, and you're more than welcome. So I suppose to round out and to clarify, Alex is back, and I'll be consulting with her, but I think from an administrative perspective, I'm still running the unit, so I should still be your first point of contact, especially with a lot of the nuts and bolts of the exam. If you've got questions or concerns, absolutely do feel free to get in touch over the next week or so. As has been the case, if there's something that I think is a bit too technical, I'll be consulting with Alex. But other than that, feel free to get in touch. And beyond that, best wishes with the exam and with the rest of your studies. Thank you very much. Bye.